The Wyoming wind screamed across the desolate plains, scouring bone-white snow from frozen earth. Silas Walker rode into its teeth, a shadow against the dying light, the weight of solitude heavier than his worn duster. Below the bluff, movement, a skeletal wagon listing like a wounded beast. A woman's desperate shout, thin as smoke, was swallowed by the gale. 5 small figures huddled behind her against the relentless cold. In that frozen heartbeat, Silas knew his isolation was about to shatter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've got something extra special saved just for you. Silas Walker leaned into the bitter wind, the worn leather of his saddle creaking a familiar protest. Below him, the vast, unforgiving expanse of his ranch, the Double W, stretched towards a horizon blurred by scudding snow clouds. It was late February 1883, and winter clung to the Wyoming territory with the tenacity of a badger in its den. The land was a study in desolation. Skeletal cottonwoods clawed at the pewter sky. The bleached bones of long-dead cattle protruded from wind-sculpted drifts, and the silence was profound, broken only by the mournful whistle through barbed wire and the crunch of his horse's hooves on the iron-hard ground. He was checking the line shack near the northern boundary, a futile gesture against the season's grip, but routine was the scaffold holding his world together. 5 years. 5 years since the influenza swept through Sweetwater like a vengeful spirit, taking Sarah and little Henry, leaving only this crushing silence and 640 acres of stubborn, grudging earth. He'd become a creature of the land itself, hardened, weathered, speaking more to his bay gelding, Dusty, than to any human soul in the sparse town miles away. His face, beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, was etched with lines carved by grief and sun and wind, his eyes the gray of winter flint, holding a distance that warned others away. The ranch house, when he returned to it, was a monument to absence, cold, tidy, smelling faintly of wood smoke, old leather, and the ghost of Sarah's rosewater. He urged Dusty up a low, snow-dusted bluff, seeking a clearer view towards the distant, jagged teeth of the Wind River Range. That's when he saw it. Movement. Down in the shallow draw where the old emigrant trail cut through his land. Not cattle, a wagon, or what remained of one. It listed sharply to one side. The rear wheel canted at an unnatural angle, the canvas cover ripped and flapping like a wounded bird's wing. His hand instinctively went to the worn walnut grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. Trouble rarely came this far out, but trouble had a way of finding solitary men. Then the wind shifted. It carried a sound, thin and frayed, yet piercing the vast quiet. A woman's voice, raw with desperation. "Hold on, just hold on. Maisie, keep Jonah warm." Silas squinted against the stinging particles of ice carried on the gale. Figures clustered around the broken wagon. One woman, tall but stooped with exhaustion or cold. And children, small shapes bundled in rags against the biting cold. 5 of them, huddled like sheep against a storm. His breath caught, a sharp, cold stab in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. Children. The sight was a physical blow, cracking the ice around memories he kept buried deep. Henry's laughter, bright as a meadowlark. He hesitated. Every instinct honed by years of solitude screamed to turn Dusty around, ride back to the empty sanctuary of his house. His own stores were lean. The winter had been brutal, the previous summer's drought leaving his root cellar sparse, his grain bins perilously low. Harlan Vance, his grasping neighbor to the east, had already made overtures about buying the Double W. Whispers carried on the wind about Silas being a broken man clinging to dust. Vance coveted the Double W's single reliable spring. Silas couldn't feed a family, couldn't open that door to the crushing weight of responsibility, the terrifying vulnerability of caring again. The wind howled, a banshee wail across the emptiness. Another cry, higher, terrified. A child's wail. It sliced through his resistance like a honed knife. Silas Walker cursed under his breath, a plume of frost hanging in the air, and nudged Dusty forward down the slope towards the stranded group. Cora Bellamy pressed her forehead against the splintered wood of the wagon's side, the cold seeping through her thin woolen shawl. Despair, colder than the Wyoming wind, threatened to swallow her whole. The snapped axle wasn't just a broken piece of wood. It was the final, shattering blow. 2 months ago, she'd had a home, a hardscrabble claim outside Laramie, a husband whose laughter warmed the small cabin. Then the fever took Jacob, swift and brutal. Then the bank, smelling blood in the water, foreclosed. All they had left was this rickety wagon, Jacob's old draft horse, Samson, who looked more bone than beast, and the clothes on their backs. She'd sold everything else for supplies, aiming for her cousin's place rumored to be near Sweetwater. Hope had been a fragile flame. The axle snuffing it out felt like fate's cruel joke. Now, stranded in this godforsaken draw, with a blizzard threatening on the horizon and 5 hungry children, she choked back a sob. "Be strong, Cora. For them." She turned to her small, shivering army. Finn, her eldest at 12 going on 40, stood rigid beside Samson, trying to shield the horse's flank from the worst of the wind with his own thin body. His jaw was clenched, mirroring the fierce determination in his eyes, Jacob's eyes. He carried the weight of being the man now, a burden far too heavy for his narrow shoulders. Beside him, Maisie, 10, clutched her twin brothers, Noah and Jonah, barely 7. Their faces were pinched and pale beneath knitted caps pulled low, eyes wide with a fear they were too young to fully articulate. Maisie hummed a tuneless song, a shaky attempt to soothe them, her own small frame trembling. Cradled against Cora's chest, wrapped in every spare scrap of cloth, baby Lila slept fitfully, her breath a faint, warm puff against Cora's neck. The silence between the children was worse than crying. It spoke of exhaustion, resignation. "The wheels broke clean, Ma," Finn stated, his voice tight. He'd been trying to assess the damage, his small hands red and raw from the cold. "Ain't no fixing it here. Not with what we got." He kicked at the frozen dirt in frustration. Cora nodded, her throat too tight for words. She scanned the barren landscape. Nothing but rolling, snow-scoured hills and the relentless sky. No sign of shelter. The meager supplies in the wagon, a half sack of flour gone damp, a small bag of beans, a dwindling wedge of salt pork, a tin of precious coffee, mocked their predicament. They couldn't stay here. Samson wouldn't last the night exposed, and neither would the children. The thought of trying to walk, carrying Lila, dragging the twins through deepening snow, it was a death sentence. "Someone's coming," Maisie whispered, her humming stopping abruptly. She pointed a mittened hand up the slope. Cora's heart hammered against her ribs. Fear warred with a desperate sliver of hope. A rider, a man on a sturdy bay horse, emerging from the blowing snow like a specter. He sat tall in the saddle, face shadowed by a wide hat, his posture rigid, unreadable. He reined in a dozen yards away, his gaze sweeping over their broken wagon, their desperate faces lingering on the children huddled together. His hand rested near his gun. Cora instinctively stepped slightly in front of Maisie and the twins, her own body a shield. Men on the frontier could be salvation or damnation. She'd learned that harsh lesson already. He didn't speak immediately. The wind filled the silence, whipping Cora's skirts around her worn boots. She saw the stark lines of his face, the flint-gray eyes that held a world of distance, and something else, a deep, weary sorrow that resonated with her own. He looked like the land itself, hard, used up, lonely. "Mornin'," he finally said, his voice a low rasp, like stones grinding together. It wasn't friendly, but it wasn't overtly hostile either. Just flat. "Trouble." Cora swallowed, forcing her voice not to shake. Axle snapped, sir. Clean through. We're stranded. She gestured helplessly at the wagon, at her children. Finn stood straighter, trying to look capable, but his shivering betrayed him. Jonah whimpered, burying his face in Maisie's side. The rancher's gaze flicked to the broken wheel, then back to Cora, then to the children, one by one. It lingered on baby Lila's sleeping form. His expression didn't change, but Cora saw a minute tightening around his eyes, a flicker in that gray stillness. He looked past them, towards the darkening clouds gathering in the west. Storm's coming. A mean one. You can't stay here. We know, sir, Cora said, the hopelessness threatening to spill over. We were heading for Sweetwater, my cousin. The lie sounded feeble even to her own ears. She had no confirmation her cousin was even there anymore. Sweetwater's nigh on 20 miles southwest, the rancher stated bluntly. Through open country. You'd freeze solid for you made 5. He paused, his gaze sweeping over them again, taking in their threadbare clothes, the hollow look in Finn's eyes, the twins' pinched faces. He shifted in the saddle. Dusty stamped a hoof, impatient. The silence stretched, filled only by the keening wind. Cora braced herself for the inevitable. He'd tip his hat, say good luck, and ride away. Leave them to the mercy of the elements and their broken wagon. He took a deep breath, the vapor pluming thickly in the frigid air. He looked not at Cora, but past her shoulder, towards the empty horizon, as if wrestling with something unseen. When he spoke again, his voice was still gruff, but a fraction less remote. Name's Walker. Silas Walker. My place is about a mile yonder. He jerked his head back the way he'd come. Got a barn. Solid. Out of this wind. Cora's breath hitched. A barn? Shelter? It was more than she'd dared hope for. Sir, Mr. Walker, we wouldn't impose, but the children. Her voice cracked. Silas Walker finally looked directly at her. That deep sorrow in his eyes seemed to war with a reluctant, almost painful sense of duty. He gave a curt nod, more to himself than to her. Ain't fittin' for young uns out here. Bring what you can carry. He nudged Dusty, turning the horse. Follow my tracks. Best hurry. He didn't offer help with the wagon, didn't dismount. He simply started back up the slope at a slow walk, expecting them to follow. An act of grudging mercy, offered with the bare minimum of words or warmth. Relief, sharp and dizzying, flooded Cora. Finn, Maisie, gather the blankets, the food sack, the coffee tin. Hurry now. Her voice cracked, but it was laced with newfound energy. We're going to shelter. The children scrambled, a sudden burst of frantic activity fueled by hope. Finn grabbed the precious sack of flour and beans. Maisie bundled the twins into their thinnest blankets, then scooped up the salt pork and coffee. Cora tightened the sling holding Lila close to her chest, her heart pounding not just with fear now, but with a terrifying, fragile gratitude. She looked at the retreating back of Silas Walker, a dark shape against the snow. He hadn't looked back. The mile felt like 10. The wind grew sharper, biting through layers of worn wool, stealing their breath. Finn struggled under the weight of the flour sack, his small legs sinking into drifts. Maisie held tightly to Noah and Jonah's hands, urging them on when their steps faltered, her own face pale with cold and effort. Cora carried Lila and led the exhausted Samson, the horse plodding wearily. They followed the deep hoof prints Silas Walker's horse had left, a fragile lifeline across the white expanse. Finally, they crested a rise. Below, nestled in a slight hollow, offering meager protection from the wind, stood a small ranch. Not prosperous. The house was low-slung, built of logs darkened by weather, smoke curling reluctantly from a stone chimney. A larger, more solid barn stood nearby, along with a small corral holding a few dispirited-looking cattle and a single milk cow. A chicken coop huddled against the barn wall. It spoke of hard work and harder times, clinging stubbornly to existence. Silas Walker was already at the barn door, wrestling it open against the wind's resistance. He didn't wave them over, just disappeared inside. They stumbled down the slope. The barn door stood open, a dark rectangle promising refuge from the screaming wind. As they approached, Silas emerged, carrying 2 battered tin lanterns. He lit them with a calloused hand, and a match struck against the doorframe, the sudden flare illuminating his stern face and the deep lines etched around his eyes. He hung one lantern just inside the door. "Barn sound," he stated, his voice echoing slightly in the sudden relative quiet as they crowded into the doorway. The interior was dim, smelling richly of dry hay, dust, horses, and manure. A warm, animal smell that felt incredibly welcoming after the sterile bite of the wind. Stalls lined one side, mostly empty. A stack of baled hay filled one corner, and loose hay was piled in another. An old buckboard wagon sat disused near the back. Hayloft's dry. Blankets in that chest. He pointed toward the sturdy wooden box near the door. "There's oats and water for the horse." He gestured toward the trough and a bin. "Water pumps outside, back corner. Freezes solid most nights, but it's workable now." He stood just inside the doorway, a barrier between them and the warmth of his house, visible through the open barn door. He hadn't invited them further. Cora felt the unspoken boundary. The barn was shelter, a concession to basic humanity. The house was his fortress, his sanctuary of solitude. She understood. She wouldn't push. "Not yet." "Thank you, Mr. Walker," Cora said, her voice thick with emotion. She met his gaze, trying to convey the depth of her gratitude. "You saved our lives tonight." Finn mumbled his thanks, eyes wide as he took in the barn's solid walls. Maisie just nodded, already pulling the twins towards the inviting pile of loose hay. Silas shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the thanks. He looked past her, towards the darkening sky. Storm will hit full force soon. Best settle in. He turned to go, back towards the house, towards his solitude. "Mr. Walker?" Cora's voice stopped him. He paused, half-turned, his face in shadow. She took a breath, clutching Lila tighter. We have some beans. A little salt pork. Not much, but we could share supper." It was an offering, a gesture of thanks, and a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm, to show they weren't just takers. Silas Walker looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. He saw the exhaustion etched on her face, the fierce protectiveness in her eyes, the vulnerability she was trying so hard to mask. He saw the children already burrowing into the hay, seeking warmth. He saw the meager sack of food Finn clutched. His gaze dropped to the rough barn floor for a moment. When he looked up, his expression remained closed, but he gave a single, slow nod. It wasn't warmth, but it wasn't refusal. "I'll bring a pot," he said, his voice low, "and some water." He turned and walked out into the gathering gloom, pulling the barn door mostly shut behind him, leaving a gap just wide enough for the lantern light to spill out onto the churned snow. Cora sagged against the doorframe, the sudden quiet of the barn pressing in. The children were already whispering, exploring their temporary haven. Shelter, warmth, the promise of shared food. It was more than she'd dared dream an hour ago. She looked out through the gap in the door. Silas Walker was a dark silhouette trudging towards the lonely house, shoulders hunched against the wind, or perhaps against the burden he'd just shouldered. Gratitude warred with a new, sharp anxiety. He'd offer the barn, water, a pot. But the look in his eyes, it wasn't welcome. It was endurance. How long would that endurance last? And what happened when the storm passed? The fragile warmth of the barn suddenly felt precarious, balanced on the knife edge of one solitary man's strained charity. The wind, finding the gap in the door, moaned like a warning. The heavy barn door thudded shut behind Silas, cutting off the lantern's yellow spill and the sight of Cora Bellamy sagging against the frame. The wind immediately snatched at his duster, a physical force pushing him towards the dark shape of his house. Inside him, a different tempest raged. The silence he'd cultivated for 5 years, thick as the dust on Sarah's forgotten sewing basket, had been shattered by the thin wail of a child and the rustle of strangers in his hayloft. "What have you done, Walker?" The question hammered against his ribs with each step through the deepening snow. Reaching the porch, he stomped his boots, the sound unnaturally loud in the pre-storm hush. He pushed open his own door, stepping into the familiar chill of the main room. It smelled of wood smoke, old coffee, and loneliness. He shrugged off his duster, hanging it on a peg beside Sarah's faded calico sunbonnet, a relic he couldn't bring himself to move. The sight of it, as always, was a small, sharp pain. He moved automatically. A large, blackened cast-iron pot was retrieved from its hook near the cold hearth. He filled it halfway with water from the covered bucket near the door. His movements were stiff, his mind replaying the scene in the draw. The woman's desperate eyes, the boy trying to be a man, the twins huddled like frozen sparrows, the baby's face barely visible in its wrappings so small. A memory flashed, unbidden and viciously bright. Henry, just turned 3, bundled against the cold, his cheeks rosy, demanding a story about horses. The ache that followed was a physical hollowing, deeper than hunger. He gripped the edge of the dry sink until his knuckles whitened, breathing hard against the tide of grief. He needed coffee. Strong. He measured precious grounds into the speckled blue enamel pot, his movements precise, a ritual against chaos. As he waited for it to boil on the small cook stove he'd fired up earlier, he stared out the small window. The barn was a darker smudge against the swirling gray. He could imagine them in there. 5 children, 5 mouths. His gaze drifted to his meager pantry shelf. A half sack of flour, a smaller sack of cornmeal, a jar of rendered fat, a twist of salt, a few withered potatoes, a small crock of molasses nearly empty. Enough for him, stretched thin through the tail end of winter. Not for 7, especially not with Harlan Vance circling like a vulture, just waiting for Silas to falter, to admit defeat, to sell the double W in its precious spring. The coffee boiled over, hissing on the hot iron, jolting him back. He snatched it off, cursing softly. He poured a cup, the bitter steam scalding his nostrils. He didn't drink it. He looked at the pot of water, the coffee pot, then deliberately pulled down a dented tin canister. Inside, nestled in cloth, were 3 precious eggs, the first his lone hen had laid in weeks. He hesitated, his hand hovering. Then, with a decisive movement, he placed all 3 beside the pot. He grabbed a worn wooden spoon and a chipped enamel mug. Just shelter. Just the barn. That's all. Inside the barn, the howl of the wind was muted to a deep, constant moan. The single lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls and piled hay. The smell of dust, dry grass, and horse was a comforting blanket after the biting sterility of the open plain. Cora took a shuddering breath, the reality of their refuge settling around her like the hay dust motes swirling in the lamplight. "Right," she said, her voice firmer than she felt, pushing off the doorframe. "Let's make this proper." Gratitude warred fiercely with the gnawing anxiety Silas Walker's closed-off demeanor had instilled. They couldn't be a burden. They had to earn this fragile sanctuary. "Finn, see to Samson." Mr. Walker said, "Oats and water. Be sparing with the oats, mind." Finn nodded, relief mixing with purpose on his young face. He immediately headed for the grain bin, his movements careful, respectful of the unfamiliar space. He found a bucket near the water trough and hauled it outside to the pump Silas had mentioned. Cora heard the rhythmic squeal and groan as he worked the frozen handle. "Maisie, love," Cora continued, unwrapping Lila from the sling. The baby fussed, rooting instinctively. "See if those blankets in the chest are dry. We'll make a nest in the hayloft." Maisie, ever practical, hurried to the heavy chest near the door. She lifted the lid, revealing neatly folded, if slightly musty, wool blankets. "They're good, Ma," she announced, pulling out 2 thick gray ones. Smell like sunshine? Well, sort of. Jonah, Noah, Cora addressed the twins who were staring wide-eyed at the cavernous space. You're on straw duty. Find the driest, softest hay you can and pile it up there. She pointed to a corner beneath the sturdy loft ladder, sheltered from the drafts sneaking under the main door. The twins, momentarily distracted from their fear, scrambled towards the loose hay pile, their small hands digging eagerly, sending golden strands flying. Cora settled on an overturned crate near the lantern, loosening her dress to nurse Lila. The baby latched on hungrily. As she fed her, Cora's eyes scanned the barn, assessing. It was solid, as Silas had said, but clearly just functional. Tools hung neatly on pegs, a worn harness, a set of farrier's tongs, a coiled rope. An old, cracked leather saddle sat on a stand. Against one wall leaned a broken-handled shovel and a wooden crate filled with tangled, rusted bits of metal. In the dimness, it felt like a snapshot of solitary life, pared down to necessity. Finn returned, lugging the heavy water bucket, breath frosting the air. He poured some into the trough for Samson, who drank noisily. Pump stiff, Ma. Nearly froze solid. Finn reported, wiping his brow. He carefully measured a scant cup of oats into the feed bin. Samson nudged him gently, a silent thank you. Maisie had spread one blanket in the chosen corner and was directing the twins' hay-piling efforts. More here, Noah. Fluff it, Jonah. Don't just dump it. Her voice, mimicking Cora's no-nonsense tone, held a thread of excitement. This was an adventure, a challenge, not just disaster. Noah, digging deeper into the hay pile, let out a small yelp. Look it! He held up a small, carved wooden object, coated in dust and chaff. It was a roughly shaped horse, its legs slightly uneven, its mane a series of jagged cuts. It was clearly old, a child's toy, lost or forgotten long ago. Cora's heart clenched. That's a fine find, Noah. Give it a brush off. She saw Maisie's eyes linger on the little horse, a flicker of longing quickly masked. Cora made a mental note. Later, perhaps, she could find a scrap of cloth for Maisie to make a doll. As Lila finished feeding, Cora burped her gently. The simple routine, the sounds of her children working together. Finn checking Samson's hooves for ice balls with surprising competence. Maisie arranging the hay nest, the twins bickering softly over the best hay, filled the barn with a fragile sense of life it hadn't known in years. It was terrifying and beautiful. How long could this last? The barn door creaked open, startling them all. Silas Walker stood framed in the opening, the blizzard's fury visible as a swirling white curtain behind him. He held the large pot of water in one hand, the coffee pot and the chipped mug in the other. A small cloth bundle was tucked under his arm. Snow dusted his hat and shoulders. His expression was unreadable in the lantern light. Brought the pot, he stated, stepping inside and kicking the door mostly shut against the wind. He placed the pot of water near the lantern, its surface already steaming faintly in the cooler barn air. He set the coffee pot and mug beside it. Then, almost reluctantly, he held out the cloth bundle. Eggs, he said, his voice gruff. For the little one. He avoided looking directly at Cora or the children, his gaze fixed on a point beyond the stalls. Cora's breath caught. Eggs. A luxury she hadn't seen in months. Mr. Walker, that's too kind. We couldn't. They're for the baby, he interrupted, not unkindly, but firmly, placing the bundle carefully beside the pot. He shifted, clearly uncomfortable. His eyes flickered over their nascent camp. Maisie smoothing a blanket, the twins now piling hay with gusto, Finn standing protectively near Samson. His gaze snagged for a split second on the little wooden horse Noah had set carefully on a beam nearby. A muscle twitched in Silas's jaw. He looked away quickly towards the pile of baled hay. Hayloft ladders sound. Warmer up there, out of the drafts down here. We're grateful for the space down here, truly, Cora said quickly, sensing his desire for them to be tucked away. less present. The loft will be perfect once we get settled. Silas gave a curt nod. He seemed about to leave, then paused. He looked at Finn, who was watching him intently. "Boy," Silas addressed him directly for the first time. Finn straightened. "That old shovel handle." Silas pointed to the broken tool leaning against the wall. "Needs fixing. Oak dowel in that crate, likely, and glue pots on the shelf yonder. If you've a mind." It wasn't a request, nor was it an order. It was an offering of sorts, a way for Finn to contribute, to be more than a burden. Finn's eyes lit up. "Yes, sir. I can fix things. Pa taught me." He strode towards the tools, eager for the task, for the validation. Silas watched him for a moment, something unreadable passing over his face. Then, without another word, he turned, pulled the barn door open against the wind's resistance, and disappeared back into the storm, heading for the solitary light of his house. The shared silence in the barn after he left was heavy. Cora looked at the pot, the coffee, the precious bundle containing the eggs. An offering, however strained. She looked at Finn, already sorting through the crate for the dowel, his brow furrowed in concentration. Maisie had taken Lila and was rocking her gently near the lantern's warmth. The twins were whispering, examining the little wooden horse. "Right," Cora said again, forcing energy into her voice. "Let's get supper going. Finn, when you found that dowel, fetch our beans and salt pork. Maisie, see if you can find a flat stone or a bit of metal near the stovepipe outside. Careful of the wind. We can heat the beans on it near the lantern for a bit of warmth. Noah, Jonah, keep piling that hay nice and high." As the children moved to their tasks, Cora knelt by the pot. She carefully unwrapped the cloth. 3 perfect brown eggs nestled inside. Such a small thing. Such a monumental gesture from a man who seemed carved from the same granite as the distant mountains. She touched one smooth shell. Hope, fragile as that shell, flickered within her. She mixed a small portion of their precious flour with water and a pinch of salt in the chipped mug Silas had brought, making a rough damper dough. She'd cook on the stone with the beans. The salt pork she sliced thinly, its rich smell filling the barn. She cracked 1 egg into a small tin cup she had in their meager supplies, whisking it with a little water. For Lila. The other 2 she would save, a gift to offer back somehow. While the beans warmed slowly on the flat stone Maisie had found and placed near the lantern's base, Cora watched Finn work. He found the oak dowel, slightly thicker than the broken handle. He was carefully scraping the broken end of the shovel shaft with his pocket knife, his tongue poking out in concentration, just like Jacob used to do. Silas Walker's simple act of giving him a task had transformed the boy, easing the desperate tension in his shoulders. Outside, the wind shrieked, rattling the barn doors. Inside, the air grew warmer, filled with the smells of cooking beans, wood smoke drifting from the house, and hay. Maisie hummed softly to Lila. Noah showed Jonah how the little wooden horse could gallop along a beam. Finn tapped the dowel gently into the shovel handle, testing the fit. Cora stirred the beans. This barn, this shared, meager meal, this fragile piece, it felt like the first trembling note of a song long forgotten. But as she glanced towards the house, a single light burning in the window like a lonely star, she remembered Silas Walker's eyes. Not cruel, but haunted, shuddered. The weight of their presence here was a stone on his heart. The storm raged outside, but the storm within him, she sensed, was far more dangerous. How long before it broke? And what would happen to them when it did? Later, as the children settled into the deep hay nest in the corner, bellies warmed by beans and a scrap of damper, Lila nestled against Cora. Content for the moment, Cora lay awake. The wind still howled, but the barn felt surprisingly secure. Finn snored softly nearby, exhausted by the day. Maisie murmured in her sleep. The twins were a tangle of limbs and quiet breaths. Cora listened to the rhythm of the storm and the rhythm of her children sleeping. Safe. For now. She thought of the eggs saved, of Finn's pride in fixing the shovel, of the little wooden horse. Small anchors in a sea of uncertainty. Then Lila stirred, whimpering, not her usual hungry or sleepy sound. A thin, fretful cry. Cora touched her cheek. Too warm, much too warm. In the dim lantern light, she saw the baby's face was flushed, her tiny brow furrowed. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Cora's heart deeper than any winter wind. Fever, out here, with no medicine, no doctor for miles, and a storm locking them in. She pulled Lila closer, rocking gently, whispering useless reassurances, her eyes wide with dawning terror in the sheltering dark. The fragile warmth of the barn suddenly felt terrifyingly insufficient. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one just beginning inside her tiny daughter. What could they do? What would Silas Walker do? The questions echoed in the hollow space, unanswered, as the wind screamed its own relentless refrain against the walls. The thin, fretful cry sliced through the barn's fragile peace like a shard of ice. Cora Bellamy clutched baby Lila closer, the unnatural heat radiating from the tiny body, searing through the layers of cloth. Fear, colder and sharper than the Wyoming blizzard hammering the walls, seized her heart. Fever, out here, miles from help, locked in by a storm with a man whose own grief was a fortress wall. Lila whimpered again, a weak, miserable sound that echoed the terror clawing at Cora's throat. Across the barn, Finn stirred in the hay nest. "Ma!" His voice was thick with sleep, instantly alert to the shift in the night's rhythm. Maisie sat up beside him, rubbing her eyes, her gaze fixing on the bundle in Cora's arms. The twins, Noah and Jonah, burrowed deeper, sensing the tension. "It's Lila," Cora whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort to control it. "She's burning up." She laid the back of her hand against Lila's forehead again, confirming the awful truth. The flush on the baby's cheeks deepened in the guttering lantern light. Maisie scrambled over, her small face etched with worry. "Is she sick, Ma? Like Pa?" The unspoken fear hung heavy, the fever that had taken Jacob with terrifying swiftness. "Shoo, love," Cora soothed, pulling Maisie close with her free arm. "It's just a fever. We'll cool her down." The words felt hollow. She had no willow bark tea, no feverfew, no cool cellar. Just a freezing barn and dwindling hope. She looked towards the house, a faint, lonely glow visible through the crack in the barn door. Silas Walker. Would he even care? Or would the specter of his own lost child make him turn away, seal them off as carriers of death? Inside the cold, silent house, Silas Walker wasn't sleeping. He sat at the rough-hewn table, a half-whittled piece of pine forgotten in his hands, staring at the dying embers in the hearth. The storm's howl was a constant pressure, but it was the other sounds that scraped his nerves raw. The muffled thumps, the occasional childish whisper carrying faintly from the barn, sounds of life. Sounds he'd buried with Sarah and Henry. He tried to ignore them, burying himself in the mindless rhythm of carving. But the memory of the baby's face, so small against Cora's shoulder, kept intruding. Then he heard it, faint but unmistakable through the wind's roar, the thin, distressed wail of an infant. It wasn't hunger. It was the sound of sickness, a sound that sent a bolt of pure, icy dread straight through him. Henry. A memory slammed into him, vivid and brutal. Henry, just 4 years old, his small body racked with fever, his eyes glassy. Sarah, frantic, bathing him with cool cloths while Silas rode through a different storm, desperate for the doctor who arrived too late. The helplessness, the crushing weight of failure, the suffocating silence that followed. It rose in his throat now, thick and choking. He dropped the whittling knife, the clatter loud in the empty room. His hands clenched into fists on the tabletop, knuckles white. He shouldn't go out there. He couldn't. Opening that door, letting that fear in again, It was inviting the wolf back into the den. Harlan Vance's smirking face flashed in his mind. The neighbor wouldn't hesitate to use weakness, especially weakness tied to sentimental foolishness like harboring strays. Let them be, a harsh inner voice urged. The storm will pass. They'll move on. Another whimper, sharper, more desperate, pierced the wind. It wasn't just memory. It was happening now, 20 yards away. A child was suffering in his barn. Cora Bellamy's face, etched with that fierce, vulnerable determination, rose before him. He'd seen that look on Sarah's face. Silas pushed back from the table with a force that made the legs screech on the plank floor. He grabbed his heavy coat and the storm lantern hanging by the door. He didn't think. He moved, yanking the door open. The blizzard's fury hit him like a physical blow, snow stinging his face. He hunched his shoulders and plunged into the white maelstrom. The lantern beam, a feeble yellow, eye against the swirling dark. Cora was dipping a scrap of clean linen into a tin cup filled with icy water Finn had braved the pump to fetch. She wrung it out and laid it gently on Lila's forehead. The baby flinched, crying out weakly. "Hush now, little dove," Cora murmured, her own fear a cold stone in her belly. "Mom is here." Maisie hovered, wringing her hands. "Should I sing to her, Ma? Pa always said singing helped." "Maybe later, love," Cora said, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "Jonah, see if there's another dry bit of cloth in that bundle." Jonah, wide-eyed but trying to help, rummaged through their meager belongings. Noah, meanwhile, had been quietly exploring the periphery of the lantern light near the pile of loose hay. "Ma," he piped up, holding something aloft. "Smells funny." It was a small, brittle bundle of dried stalks and faded purple flowers, tied with twine, half buried in the hay, likely forgotten years ago. Cora squinted. Lavender? Maybe some wild mint? Her grandmother had used such things. A flicker of desperate hope sparked. "Bring it here, Noah." She crushed a few dried leaves and flowers between her fingers, inhaling the faint, dusty sweetness. "Not much, but something." "Maisie, put a few pinches of this in that cup of water. Let's steep. We'll try a little on a cloth, see if it soothes her." Finn, unable to fix this, had returned to the shovel Silas had given him to mend. The task was a tangible anchor. He'd found the glue pot, thick and cold, and was patiently warming a small amount near the lantern, determined to make the repair perfect to prove his worth. The rhythmic scrape of his knife, smoothing the dowel, was the only steady sound besides the storm and Lila's fretful cries. The barn door crashed open, snow swirling in violently. Silas Walker stood framed in the entrance, coated in white, the storm lantern held high. His face was grim, etched with lines deeper than the cold could carve, his flint-gray eyes scanning the scene immediately, landing on Cora and the feverish baby. Cora's breath caught. He'd come. Relief warred with the fear of his reaction. "Mr. Walker," it came on so fast. Silas didn't speak. He stepped inside, kicking the door shut against the gale. He hung the lantern on a higher peg, casting more light. He strode towards them, his movements stiff, his gaze fixed on Lila's flushed face. He stopped a few feet away, as if an invisible barrier held him back. The sight of the sick infant, the memory of Henry so vivid, was a physical pain in his chest. He swallowed hard. "Fever." His voice was gravelly, barely audible over the wind. Cora nodded, tears threatening. "Yes, burning up. We're trying cool cloths, and Noah found some old lavender, maybe mint." She gestured weakly at the steeping cup Maisie held. Silas's gaze flickered to the dried herbs, then back to Lila. He saw the fear in Cora's eyes, the desperate hope in Maisie's, Finn's fierce concentration on his task, the twins' wide, scared eyes. It was a tableau of vulnerability that mirrored his own deepest wound. He couldn't walk away. Not again. Not this time. He turned abruptly and walked towards the section of the barn where old crates and forgotten tools were stored. He rummaged for a moment, pulling out a small, dented copper basin. He carried it back and set it on the crate near Cora. "Snow," he said gruffly. "Pack it tight. Melt it slow by the lantern. Cooler than pump water." It was a simple suggestion, born of harsh experience. Then, without looking at her, he reached into the deep pocket of his coat. He pulled out a small, dark glass bottle, stoppered with cork. He held it out towards Cora. "Witch hazel," he muttered. "Sarah, my wife, used it. For fevers. Rub it on the skin. Might help draw the heat." Offering it felt like handing over a piece of his own grief, a tangible connection to the past he kept locked away. His hand trembled slightly. Cora stared at the bottle, then up at his face. The stark pain etched there, the monumental effort this small act cost him, struck her deeply. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. She took the bottle, its cool glass a stark contrast to Lila's heat. "Thank you, Mr. Walker." He nodded curtly, unable to hold her gaze. He looked instead at Finn, who was carefully applying the warmed glue to the dowel. "Good fit," Silas observed, his voice slightly less strained. It was an acknowledgement, small but significant. Finn looked up, a flicker of pride breaking through his worry. "Yes, sir." Almost set, Silas shifted his weight, his eyes drawn back to Lila, who was whimpering pitifully. Cora uncorked the witch hazel, the sharp, clean scent filling the air. She dipped a corner of the cloth into the snowmelt water Maisie had prepared with the lavender, then added a drop of the witch hazel. Gently, she bathed Lila's tiny wrists, her neck, her little feet. The baby squirmed but seemed to quiet fractionally at the cool touch combined with the faint herbal scent. Silas watched, a muscle working in his jaw. The sight of Cora's tenderness, the small, desperate measures, the shared focus in a lantern-lit barn, it was achingly familiar and utterly alien. He felt the old walls inside him tremble. He couldn't stay. The weight of memory, the fear of caring, was too heavy. Storms breaking, he lied, his voice rough. By morning, he turned and walked swiftly back to the door, pulling it open against the wind and vanishing into the swirling snow without another word, leaving the copper basin and the precious bottle behind. The long hours crawled by. Cora kept vigil, alternating cool compresses with gentle applications of the witch hazel and lavender water. Maisie helped tirelessly, fetching fresh snow for the basin, singing soft lullabies when Lila fussed. Finn finished the shovel, the handle solid and true, a small beacon of accomplishment in the sea of worry. Noah and Jonah, eventually succumbing to exhaustion, curled together near the warmest part of the hay pile, the little wooden horse clutched in Noah's hand. Lila's fever burned fiercely, but she drank a little water sweetened with the tiniest drop of molasses from their supplies. She didn't worsen dramatically, but the heat didn't break. Cora's eyes felt gritty with exhaustion and fear. The witch hazel helped, Silas's basin helped, but it wasn't enough. What if it was more than a simple fever? What if it was the same sickness that took Jacob? The thought was a cold knife twisting. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the barn boards, the wind's fury lessened from a scream to a mournful sigh. The storm was finally easing. Cora laid a fresh, cool cloth on Lila's brow, her hope fraying thin. She needed medicine, real medicine, but Sweetwater was still miles away, the trail buried under deep drifts. She heard the crunch of boots on the frozen snow outside. The barn door opened slowly. Silas Walker stood there, hatless, his face pale and etched with lines of a sleepless night. He looked older, wearier. His eyes went immediately to Cora, then to Lila. "No change?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Cora shook her head, tears welling despite her resolve. "The fever holds. The witch hazel, it helps truly. Thank you." But she couldn't voice the terrifying possibility. Silas stepped fully inside, closing the door. He looked at the baby, her breathing rapid and shallow, then at Cora's exhausted, despairing face. He looked at Finn, standing protectively nearby, at Maisie asleep curled beside the twins. He looked around the barn, no longer just a shelter, but a place filled with the palpable tension of a family fighting for their youngest. He took a deep breath, the air cold in his lungs. The memory of Henry's final hours, the desperate, useless ride for help, pressed down on him. He'd failed then. He couldn't fail again, not when the remedy might lie just out of reach. Harlan Vance's smug face flashed again. The man would likely be watching, waiting for Silas to show weakness, to leave his place vulnerable. But Vance didn't matter right now. Only the tiny life burning up in the copper basin did. His gaze settled on Cora. "Doc Henderson," he stated, his voice low but firm, cutting through the dawn quiet. "In Sweetwater. He's got medicine." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Trails buried. Drifts are deep. Horse'll struggle." Cora's heart plummeted. It was impossible. "You can't. Mr. Walker, it's too dangerous." "The snow. It's dangerous sitting here," Silas interrupted, his flint-gray eyes holding hers. There was no hesitation in them now, only a grim resolve that hadn't been there before. The internal battle was over, at least for this moment. "I know the land. Know where the drifts pile. I'll take the bay." He's strong. He turned towards a stall where his horse stood. "Saddle up, Finn. Quick now. We're burning daylight." He didn't ask. He commanded. It was happening. As Finn scrambled to obey, a new kind of fear gripping him. Fear for the man, now risking himself. Silas strode to the barn door and pulled it wide. The world outside was a blinding expanse of white, pristine and treacherous. He scanned the newly sculpted landscape, his practiced eye assessing the depth of the drifts against the fence lines, the path to the road. Then his gaze froze. Down near the frozen creek that fed his precious spring, partially obscured by snow-laden sagebrush, were tracks. Not deer, not cattle, the deep, distinct imprint of a shod horse. Fresh, very fresh, made since the snow stopped, headed towards the spring, then veering sharply away towards the eastern boundary, towards Harlan Vance's land. Someone had been here, watching, in the lull of the storm. Silas's blood ran cold, colder than the Wyoming dawn. Vance wasn't just waiting. He was prowling. And now Silas was about to ride away, leaving the double W and the vulnerable souls in his barn unprotected. The weight of his decision to go to town suddenly felt infinitely heavier, the pristine snow hiding threats far more dangerous than the drifts. The pristine expanse of snow, glittering under the weak dawn light, felt like a taunt. Silas Walker stared at the tracks near the frozen creek, the deep, deliberate imprints of a single-shod horse, circling his spring before veering east towards Harlan Vance's Barvey spread. Fresh, made in the deceptive lull after the blizzard's fury before the world had fully woken. Watching, the cold that seeped into Silas's bones now had nothing to do with the Wyoming morning. Vance wasn't just waiting for Silas to falter. He was scouting, measuring his moment. And Silas was about to hand it to him on a silver platter by riding away. Behind him, Finn struggled with Dusty's saddle, the heavy leather slick with frost. The boy's face was pale, etched with worry that mirrored Silas's own, but layered with a fierce determination to help. Silas forced his gaze away from the damning tracks. Lila's rapid, shallow breathing, the unnatural heat radiating from her tiny form in Cora's arms, was the only thing that mattered. Failure wasn't an option. Not this time. He had to believe Doc Henderson's medicine could work where Sarah's herbs hadn't. "Girth tight, boy," Silas rasped, his voice raw from the cold and unshed emotion. He checked Finn's work, fingers numb, adding an extra tug. Dusty snorted, breath pluming thickly, sensing the urgency. Silas grabbed his worn saddlebags, stuffing in a water skin, a strip of tough jerky, and the last 2 hard biscuits from his meager stores. His fingers brushed against something small and hard wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom. Henry's smooth river stone, carried for luck or perhaps punishment, all these years. He hesitated, the cool, familiar shape a jolt to his system. Don't think. Just ride. He shoved the stone deeper and buckled the flap. He turned back to the barn doorway. Cora stood there, Lila bundled against her chest, her face gaunt with exhaustion and fear, yet holding a desperate hope. Maisie hovered beside her, clutching the small copper basin. Noah and Jonah peered out from behind Finn, their usual curiosity muted by the heavy atmosphere. "Keep using the witch hazel," Silas instructed, meeting Cora's eyes. He saw the unspoken question, what about the tracks? He couldn't burden her with it. Not yet. Cool cloths. Snow melt. Finn nosed the pump. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the children, then landing on Finn. The boy stood straighter, trying to fill the space Silas would leave. Silas made a decision, swift and reckless. He unhooked the heavy Winchester rifle from his saddle scabbard. Its weight was a familiar comfort, a tool of survival as much as the plow. He held it out to Finn. "Boy," Silas said, his voice low and serious. "You know this." Finn's eyes widened, darting from the rifle to Silas's face. Pa show me some, sir." "Before, barrel down. Safety on unless you see trouble. And only if your ma says." Silas thrust the rifle into Finn's startled hands. "Barn door stays barred. No one comes in you don't know. No one. You hear?" Finn swallowed hard, his knuckles white on the walnut stock. He nodded, a grave understanding settling over his young features. "Yes, sir. Barred. No one." Cora's breath hitched. The significance of Silas entrusting them with his firearm, leaving them a means of defense in his absence, wasn't lost on her. "Mr. Walker, be careful." The snow. Silas just nodded curtly. He couldn't afford words. He swung up into the saddle, the leather creaking loudly in the brittle air. Dusty sidestepped, eager to move. Silas took one last look at the vulnerable cluster in the barn doorway. The feverish child, the exhausted mother, the children suddenly looking too small against the vast, white world. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture as much for himself as for them, then nudged Dusty forward, heading not directly for the buried trail to Sweetwater, but skirting wide, giving the suspicious tracks near the spring a wide berth. The crunch of Dusty's hooves breaking through the crusted snow was the only sound in the frozen world. The wind had died, leaving an eerie, oppressive silence broken only by the occasional crack of a snow-laden branch. The landscape was transformed, sculpted into treacherous dunes of white that had dips, rocks, and frozen creek beds. Silas guided Dusty with instinct born of decades on this land, reading the subtle contours beneath the blanket, avoiding the deep drifts that piled against fences and in the lee of hills. Still, progress was agonizingly slow. The big bay labored, his breath roaring, sweat darkening his flanks despite the cold. Silas leaned low over Dusty's neck, urging him on. Each laborious step felt like a betrayal. He was leaving the double W undefended. Vance's tracks burned in his mind. What if the man doubled back? What if he saw Silas leave and decided a stranded woman and children were easy leverage to get the spring? The Winchester in Finn's hands was a poor defense against Vance's cunning. Silas's gut churned. He saw Sarah's face, not in sickness, but in life, her smile as she watched Henry chase butterflies in the meadow below the house. That meadow was buried now. That life was buried. He'd failed to protect them. The fear of failing again, of losing more innocence under his watch, was a physical weight dragging at him. He pushed Dusty harder up a long incline. The horse stumbled, plunging chest deep into a hidden drift. Silas was thrown forward, grabbing mane to stay mounted. Dusty lunged, powerful muscles straining, snow flying. For a heart-stopping moment, Silas thought they were stuck. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked him. Trapped. Helpless. Just like Henry. He dug his heels in, voice raw. "Hump, Dusty, hump." The horse gathered himself, surged again, and broke free onto firmer ground. Silas reined him in, both man and beast breathing hard, plumes of vapor mingling in the still air. He patted Dusty's steaming neck. "Good boy, good boy." The praise was as much for himself, a shaky affirmation that he could still fight, still move forward. He scanned the white expanse. Sweetwater was still miles away, hidden behind the next series of rises. He pulled out the strip of jerky, gnawing mechanically. The taste was of salt and smoke and desperation. Back in the barn, the silence after Silas left was heavy. Cora barred the heavy door as instructed, the solid thunk a small comfort. She turned to find Finn carefully propping the Winchester against the wall near the door, within easy reach but pointed safely down, just as Silas had shown. The responsibility sat visibly on his young shoulders. "Right," Cora said, pushing her own fear down. Action was the antidote to dread. "Maisie, fresh snow for the basin, please. Finn, check on Samson. Make sure he's warm enough. Noah, Jonah, see if you can find more of that loose hay. Pile it thick near the wall here, away from the drafts. We need to keep the warmth in." Maisie grabbed the basin and headed for the small gap near the door where snow had drifted inside. Finn moved towards the stall where Samson stood, the old draft horse seeming to sense the tension, his ears flicking nervously. The twins, glad for a concrete task, scrambled towards the hay pile. Cora sank onto the crate near the lantern, adjusting Lila in her arms. The baby felt slightly less like a burning coal, but her breathing was still too quick, her whimpers constant and weak. Cora dipped a clean corner of cloth into the witch hazel mixture Maisie had prepared earlier and gently bathed Lila's temples, her tiny wrists. "Hold on, little dove," she whispered, the words of fervent prayer. "Help's coming. Silas is coming." Saying his name felt strange, intimate. The man who was a fortress of grief was now their sole lifeline. She looked around the barn, no longer just shelter, but a fragile stronghold. The mended shovel stood proudly against the wall, testament to Finn's skill. The copper basin gleamed dully. The smell of hay, horse, and the sharp tang of witch hazel filled the air. It was becoming their space, a haven carved out of desperation and unexpected, gruff kindness. A memory surfaced, sharp and sweet. Jacob, early in their marriage, building a makeshift cradle for Finn out of scrap wood, his big hands surprisingly gentle. Silas's hands, calloused and scarred, offering the witch hazel bottle. There was that same reluctant gentleness beneath the hardness. Noah's voice piped up from the depths of the hayloft ladder. "Ma, look, blankets." He and Jonah were dragging down two thick, albeit dusty and moth-eaten, horse blankets. They was way up top. "Good find, boys." Cora managed a smile. "Shake 'em out good, away from Lila. We can use 'em for extra cover." Resourcefulness. They still had that. Finn returned from Samson's stall. "He's all right, Ma. Ate some hay. Water ain't frozen yet." He picked up the Winchester again, not aiming it, just holding it, getting used to its weight and significance. "You think Mr. Walker, you think he'll make it? Through all that snow?" Cora met his worried gaze. "He knows the land, Finn, and he's got a strong horse. He'll make it." She had to believe it. For Lila. For all of them. As the gray morning light strengthened, filtering weakly through the high barn windows, Cora kept her vigil. Maisie brought fresh snow, whispering songs to Lila. Finn paced near the door, the rifle held awkwardly but resolutely. The twins shook out the old blankets, their movements subdued. The sense of waiting was immense, pressing down on them all. Silas crested the final rise before the long descent into the Sweetwater Valley. The town lay below, smoke curling from chimneys, a welcome sight amidst the white. Relief, thin but potent, washed over him. He'd made it. Dusty heaved, his sides slick with sweat and lather. Silas patted him again, whispering praise. "Almost there, fella. Almost." He nudged Dusty forward, picking a path down the slope, aiming for the main street. He passed the outskirts, the livery stable, the blacksmith shop, smoke pouring from its forge. His eyes scanned automatically, assessing. Then he saw it, parked outside the small, clapboard office of the land agent, a sleek black buggy. Hitched to it was a familiar, powerful chestnut gelding, Harlan Vance's favorite mount. Silas's blood ran cold. Vance wasn't just prowling the Double W. He was here, in town, likely at the land office, plotting. Paperwork moved faster than bullets sometimes. The timing couldn't be coincidence. Vance knew Silas was gone. Was he finalizing a claim? Spreading lies? Buying off officials? The relief Silas felt moments ago curdled into a fresh wave of dread. Getting the medicine was only half the battle. He had to get back. Fast. He urged Dusty into a trot, the exhausted horse responding gamely, heading straight for Doc Henderson's small house at the end of the street. Every second counted now. For Lila, for the vulnerable family in his barn, and for the land that held the ghosts of his past, and, perhaps, the fragile seeds of a future he hadn't dared imagine. Back at the Double W, the afternoon light was fading, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Cora had managed to get a few drops of water sweetened with the last scrapings of molasses into Lila. The baby slept fitfully, her fever a stubborn enemy. Maisie sat nearby, mending a tiny tear in Jonah's mitten with a needle and thread salvaged from their wagon bundle, her brow furrowed in concentration. Finn stood watch at the small, high window facing the ranch house and the spring beyond, the Winchester resting on the sill, barrel pointing safely upwards. "Snow's all messed up down by the creek, Ma," he reported, his voice tight, like someone was poking around again. Cora's heart skipped a beat. "Vance, it had to be. Just keep watch, Finn," she said, trying to sound calm. "Remember what Mr. Walker said. Bar door." Noah, restless, wandered towards the back of the barn where the old buckboard sat. He poked around the disused wagon seat. "Look, Jonah!" He held up a long, rusted metal rod with a curved end, like a giant hook. "What's this for?" Before Jonah could speculate, Finn turned from the window, his face suddenly pale. "Ma, Ryder, coming from the east. Not Mr. Walker." Cora froze, ice flooding her veins. She carefully laid Lila in a nest of hay and blankets, rushing to stand behind Finn. Peering out the high window, she saw a single rider on a dark horse, emerging from the copse of trees near the boundary with Vance's land. He wasn't heading straight for the barn, but angling towards the frozen creek, towards the springs Silas guarded so fiercely. The rider wore a heavy coat and a hat pulled low, but the set of his shoulders, the way he moved, wasn't Vance. It was one of his men. He dismounted near the creek bank, crouching down, examining something on the ground near the ice. Then he pulled something from his saddlebag, a small axe. "What's he doing, Ma?" Finn whispered, his finger hovering near the Winchester's trigger guard. Cora didn't know, but the intent was clear. He wasn't lost. He was there for a reason, and that reason threatened the fragile safety Silas had left them. "Get away from the window, Finn," she ordered quietly, pulling him back. Everyone to the back, near the buckboard. Quietly, her mind raced. The bar door, the rifle. Could they hold out if he tried to get in? Where's Silas? The medicine Lila desperately needed felt suddenly like a distant dream, overshadowed by the immediate danger creeping towards their sanctuary in the gathering twilight. The rider raised the axe. The axe glinted cold and purposeful in the fading afternoon light. Cora Bellamy's breath hitched, ice flooding her veins. The rider, one of Vance's hired hands, no doubt, wasn't just looking. He was acting. He swung the small axe hard against the thick ice encasing Silas Walker's precious spring head. Chunk! The sound carried on the still, cold air, sharp as a gunshot inside the barn. He's trying to foul it, Cora realized with dawning horror. Damage the source, make the land worthless, or force Silas out. "Ma," Finn whispered, knuckles white on the Winchester stock, his voice tight with fear and a desperate desire to act. He's chopping. Stay back, Finn, Cora ordered, her voice low and fierce, pulling him away from the window. Barrel down. Remember, panic warred with a surge of protective fury. This spring wasn't just water. It was Silas's past, their precarious present, and maybe, just maybe, their future. She couldn't let Vance destroy it. Her eyes darted around the shadowed barn, landing on Noah, who still clutched the long, rusted hay hook he'd found. An idea, reckless and born of desperation, sparked. Noah, give me that hook. Finn, you stand ready by the door. Not the window. If he comes near you, shout. Loud. Maisie, you, and the twins get behind the buckboard. Keep Lila covered. Silas Walker urged the exhausted Dusty into a shambling trot down Sweetwater's Main Street. The small brown bottle of fever tincture from Doc Henderson felt like a live coal in his coat pocket, burning with urgency. Dusty's labored breaths echoed the frantic pounding of Silas's heart. Hold on, little one. Just hold on. He'd shoved past Vance's smug presence outside the land office, ignoring the man's mocking tip of his hat. Paperwork could wait. A life couldn't. He bypassed the livery, no time, and headed straight for the general store. He needed supplies they couldn't spare: flour, cornmeal, a twist of sugar for the medicine, maybe a few precious dried apples. As he dismounted, stiff and aching, Sheriff Tate emerged from his office, squinting against the late afternoon sun glinting off the snow. Walker? Heard you rode in like the devil himself was chasing you. Vance was looking mighty pleased with himself over at Landry's office. The sheriff's tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. Silas paused, hand on the store door. Vance sent a man out to my place. While I was gone, messing with my spring. The words tasted like ash. Woman and kids sheltering in my barn. Sheriff Tate's expression hardened. That's so? Vance pushing his luck again. You see who? Didn't get a look at his face. Ride the big dun. Headed east for my creek. Silas met the sheriff's gaze. If that spring's fouled, he didn't finish. The threat was clear. Vance wouldn't just be stealing land. He'd be threatening survival. The sheriff nodded slowly. Noted, Walker. You get on back. I'll have a word with Mr. Vance about trespass and malicious mischief. Seen him myself heading out towards your way not an hour ago, after his business with Landry. He touched his hat brim. Ride careful. Silas's blood ran colder than the Wyoming snow. Vance wasn't just sending men. He was going himself. Now, he abandoned the store, swung back on a Dusty, and pointed the weary horse towards home, praying he wasn't already too late. Cora took a deep, steadying breath, the cold iron of the hay hook solid in her grip. She unbarred the barn door just enough to slip out, pulling it mostly shut behind her. The frigid air bit her face. The rider, 20 yards away near the spring head, was focused on his task, rhythmically hacking at the ice near the source, trying to dislodge sediment or damage the flow. Chunk! Chunk! He hadn't noticed her yet. Hey! Cora's voice rang out, sharper than the axe blows, echoing in the quiet hollow. The man jerked upright, startled. He turned, squinting towards the barn. Seeing just a woman, his surprise turned to a sneer. This ain't your concern, lady, he called back, hefting the axe. Just doing some digging. This is Silas Walker's land, Cora stated, stepping further out, planting her feet firmly on the packed snow. She raised the hay hook, not threateningly, but making it visible. A tool, but a potential weapon. That's his spring. You're trespassing, and you're damaging his property. She kept her voice loud, clear, hoping Finn could hear inside. My boy's inside. He's got a rifle pointed right at you. It was a bluff, but she poured every ounce of her fear for Lila, her fury at this violation, into the words. You take one more swing, mister, and you answer to him and to Sheriff Tate. The man hesitated, his sneer faltering. He glanced towards the barn, scanning the high window, the bar door. He couldn't see Finn, but the certainty in Cora's voice, the defiant set of her shoulders, the glint of the long hook. It gave him pause. His job was sabotage, not a shootout with Kid. He lowered the axe slightly. "Just following orders, ma'am," he muttered, less sure now. "Then follow this order," Cora shot back, her voice trembling but unwavering. "Get off this land. Now, and tell Harlan Vance Silas Walker protects what's his." She took another step forward, the hook held steady. Inside the barn, Finn banged the butt of the Winchester hard against the door frame. Bang! The sound was startlingly loud. The rider flinched. He looked from Cora to the barn, then back towards the Easter trail. The calculation was clear in his eyes. Trouble versus a quick retreat. Muttering a curse, he shoved the axe into his saddlebag, mounted quickly, and spurred his horse away from the spring, back the way he'd come, without another word. Cora sagged, the hay hook dipping, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The immediate threat was gone, but the vulnerability remained. Where was Silas? Silas crested the final rise, overlooking the double W as the last rays of sun bled across the snow. The sight that greeted him stopped Dusty in his tracks. Down by the spring, a rider, Vance's man on the dun, was galloping away east. And standing near the barn, silhouetted against the twilight, was Cora, holding a long, unfamiliar tool like a staff. The barn door was open, Finn visible in the gap, the Winchester in his hands. Relief warred with fury. They were safe, but Vance had dared to come here. He nudged Dusty down the slope at a bone-jarring trot. Cora turned as he approached, her face pale but resolute in the gloom. Finn lowered the rifle, a wave of exhaustion and relief washing over his young features. He was at the spring. "Chop in," Cora said as Silas reined in, his voice catching. We ran him off." Silas dismounted stiffly, his eyes scanning Cora, then Finn, then the spring head. He saw the fresh axe marks on the ice, the disturbed snow. Rage, cold and deep, tightened his chest. But overriding it was a profound, staggering relief. They'd held the line. Vance was in town, he rasped, pulling the precious medicine bottle from his pocket. "Sheriff knows. Saw him heading this way after me." He handed the bottle to Cora. "Doc said 5 drops in water every 4 hours. Sugar helps it go down." Cora's hands closed around the cool glass, tears finally spilling over. "Thank you," she whispered, the words thick with emotion. She turned and hurried into the barn towards Lila. Silas followed, pausing only to take the Winchester from Finn with a curt nod. "Did good, boy." He barred the door firmly behind them. Inside, the barn felt different, warmer despite the chill. The lantern light glowed on the faces turned towards Cora as she knelt by Lila. The baby was fretful, her fever still high. Cora measured the drops with trembling hands, mixed them with a little snowmelt water and a precious pinch of sugar Finn offered from their stores. Gently, she spooned the mixture into Lila's mouth. The baby fussed, swallowed, fussed again. They watched, the silence thick with hope and fear. Minutes crawled by. Slowly, gradually, Lila's frantic whimpering eased. Her breathing, while still rapid, seemed less shallow. The terrible flush on her cheeks lessened, fraction by fraction. She sighed, a small, ragged sound, and drifted into a deeper, less restless sleep. A collective sigh of relief, soft as the settling hay, filled the barn. Maisie burst into quiet tears, burying her face in Cora's shoulder. Finn slumped against the wall, the adrenaline draining away. Noah and Jonah simply stared, wide-eyed, at their sleeping sister. Silas stood near the door, watching the scene. The sight of Cora cradling the now peaceful baby, the exhausted children, the palpable relief, it cracked something deep inside the granite wall he'd built. He saw not strangers imposing, but people. People fighting, surviving, caring. People who had defended his home when he couldn't. The ghost of Henry, always hovering at the edge of his vision, didn't bring the usual sharp pain, but a softer, poignant ache. Life, stubborn and resilient, had returned to the double W. He moved stiffly to the pile of baled hay and sat down heavily, weariness crashing over him. He pulled off his gloves, fumbling in his coat pocket. His fingers closed not on the jerky he brought back, but on the small, smooth stone wrapped in oilcloth. Henry's stone. He unwrapped it, the cool, water-worn surface familiar against his calloused palm. He looked at it for a long moment, then at Cora, gently rocking Lila. Without a word, he walked over and placed the smooth gray stone carefully beside the sleeping baby in the nest of hay. A talisman, a silent blessing, a passing of the torch. Cora looked up, her eyes meeting his. She saw the raw vulnerability there, the unspoken offering. She touched the stone gently, then covered Silas's rough hand with her own for a brief, electric moment. "Thank you, Silas," she said, his name sounding natural, necessary. "For everything." The next week saw the Wyoming landscape begin its slow thaw. Snowdrifts shrank, revealing patches of frozen earth and the first brave tips of green grass. Icicles dripped musical tears from the barn roof. Lila's fever broke completely, replaced by the healthy, demanding cries of a hungry infant. Hope, tentative but bright, took root. One crisp morning, Silas emerged from the ranch house to find Cora standing near the porch, looking out towards the muddy yard. Finn was carefully oiling the newly repaired shovel handle. Maisie sat on the steps, humming to Lila bundled in a blanket. Noah and Jonah were poking at the softening earth near the foundation with sticks. Cora turned as he approached. "Spring's comin'," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "Ground'll be workable soon. Thought, maybe we could put in a kitchen garden here. Near the house. Peas, beans, maybe some carrots." She gestured towards a sunny patch. If that's agreeable. Silas looked at the spot. Sarah had wanted a garden there. He'd never gotten around to it. The emptiness he'd carried for so long felt less like a void and more like space. Space that could be filled. "Good spot," he agreed gruffly. "Son's right." He walked over to the small workshop shed beside the barn. Inside, amidst the tools and stacked wood, he found a piece of seasoned pine plank, about a foot long. He took his whittling knife and sat on a stump in the weak sunshine, streaming through the open door. He didn't plan. His hands moved with a purpose born of quiet certainty. He carved away the rough edges, smoothing the surface. Then, with careful, deliberate strokes, he began to shape letters. Finn wandered over, curious. "What you making, Mr. Walker?" Silas didn't look up, focused on the groove of the W. "Something that's been a long time coming, boy." Later, as the sun dipped towards the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, Silas took the carved plank, a hammer, and a nail. Cora and the children gathered, watching silently. He walked to the main gatepost of the Double W Ranch, the one facing the trail. He positioned the plank carefully, the freshly carved letters clear and deep, Walker and Bellamy. He drove the nail home with 3 solid strikes that echoed in the quiet evening. He stepped back, dusting his hands. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The new name, standing solid against the weathered post, spoke of a claim staked not just on land, but on a future forged in shared struggle and unexpected grace. It spoke of a home, no longer solitary, built from dust and despair, but watered now with hope and the quiet resilience of a family found. Cora moved to stand beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. Finn stood tall on Silas's other side, pride shining in his eyes. Maisie held Lila, pointing tiny fingers at the new sign. Noah and Jonah traced the carved letters with odd fingers. Silas Walker looked out over his land, their land. The snow was retreating, revealing the resilient earth beneath. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with the soft sounds of children. The lowing of the milk cow Finn had started tending, the promise of seeds soon to be sown. The weight of the past was still there, a part of him, but it no longer anchored him to solitude. It was a foundation now, upon which something new, something fragile and fiercely beautiful, was being built. He took a deep breath of the cold, clean air scented with damp earth and wood smoke. For the first time in 5 long winters, the air didn't feel like ice in his lungs. It felt like a beginning. He allowed himself, just for a moment, to feel the warmth seeping in, turning dust into home.